Hello and welcome to the State DOT Engagement, Relationship Building, and Advocacy webinar hosted by Rails to Trails Conservancy. This session will focus on how to build a working relationship with your state DOT and the role of DOTs in shaping policy at the local, state, and federal levels. So we're very excited to host this session. The format for this session is a moderated dialogue with time for audience Q&A at the end. If we do not get to all of the audience questions, we commit to following up after the webinar with answers. My name's Kim Chesser, and I'm the State Agency Advocacy Specialist for Rails to Trails Conservancy. I'll be serving as your moderator and participating in the discussion. In my role with RTC, I work closely with State Department of Transportation to advocate for successful implementation of their Transportation Alternative Program. I focus on improving how state agencies implement federal and state funding programs and policies for trail and active transportation and elevate best practices. Prior to joining RTC, I served as the director of the Delaware Office of Highway Safety, and I was responsible for the oversight and administration of WSDOT federal grants and programs. I'm joined today by Barb Chamberlain, Active Transportation Division Director for Washington State Department of Transportation, to hear about her perspective on engaging with advocates from the state DOT level and the role of state DOTs in shaping transportation policy. I'm also joined today by Ken Bryan, Senior Strategist for External Relations for Rails to Trails Conservancy. Ken has decades of experience in influencing the Florida Department of Transportation to make on commitments to trails as reflected in the state plans, priorities, and ongoing investments. And so I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues on the panel to further introduce themselves and provide some opening comments before our moderated discussion. And Barb, we'll start with you.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Kim. And thanks to Rails to Trails for putting this together and bringing us all together in this virtual space. I will say I got my start as a trail volunteer and advocate in North Idaho on the North Idaho Centennial Trail. That was our extension of the Spokane River Centennial Trail on the Washington side. And I wanted a great place to ride my bike. And that is also the first time I encountered a state highway engineer. There was a project that involved stubbing off a bit of highway because they were going to send people up over a bridge. And we wanted the trail to follow that highway route, run along beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene. And the highway engineer's first response was, well, let's just let we'll just do it and leave drivers there for a while, and then we'll see if we have room for a trail. That was maybe not the last time I heard something like that. We did get the trail into that spot, not as an afterthought and not after letting drivers establish new driving habits. They were closing the end of the highway. Like, why not just put the trail there? So that was an early sort of formative experience. I will fast forward pretty quickly through what I've had the opportunity to be involved in since then, because it's a very serendipitous path. You take a bend and that's where it takes you. That trail advocacy went on my resume, my civic resume, when I ran for office, and I was elected to the Idaho State Legislature a couple of times, then unelected on my third try. Went to grad school, was able to go to work at WSU Spokane, where I led the communications and the public affairs work. And that involved a lot of congressional interaction, a lot of interacting with state legislators, and being on policy committees through the Chamber of Commerce. That was another way to plug into a policy agenda space. From there, I started bike commuting, and that made me an advocate yet again, served on the Bicycle Advisory Board and other things. And then the opportunity came up to apply to be the executive director for Washington Bikes. And some of you who've been in the space a long time would remember maybe the Bicycle Alliance of Washington. I led the renaming and had great policy success there as well. Always through relationship building. I will say the through line for everything I've done has been relationship building and listening. And then some of that relationship building included talking to the State Department of Transportation about what level of leadership they might have for walking and biking concerns. They created the division and advertised for a director, and I took that position in March 2017, and I've been there ever since. And we've grown quite a bit. It's been quite a ride. We have a very supportive legislature, which is fantastic. One of our accomplishments I'm really proud of is our active transportation plan. We were way overdue for an update, so we don't even call it an update. We didn't start from the old plan. We created an entirely new plan. It won multiple awards, state, regional, and national, and really laid the groundwork for a lot of great, I think, legislative action since then and our own work inside the agency. And I'll stop there and look forward to the questions and the discussion.
Great, thank you. And Ken?
So yeah, I kind of took the exact opposite path that Barb did, in that I started in local government and parks and recreation, then worked my way into county administration. I took the job as an advocate at Rails, the Trails Conservancy, really with the goal of not being around very long. My goal was to get to Tallahassee, start working on my master's degree, and ultimately go to work for a state agency. And I realized early on that I couldn't be an agent of change working for a state agency, that I could be more useful as an advocate, being empowered by a national organization, Rails to Trails Conservancy. So that's kind of the path of how I got here. If we could go on to the next slide, please, Kim. I thought it might be good just to help set the stage for some of the things that I'll be talking about later, to kind of understand. So what we'll be talking about today not only applies to a state DOT, but it also applies to other state agencies. Here in Florida, this is just kind of the flow of transportation alternative and RTP funds. And so in Florida, our RTP program is administered by our Department of Environmental Protections, the Office of Greenways and Trails. So to access that federal funding source, you have to work through our state Department of Environmental Protections. And then even pursuing TA through the traditional DOT route, you still have to interact with your district offices, your MPOs and TPOs, as well in many cases with your counties, and getting into the priority list and working your way into the work program. And this chart doesn't even really show some of the other parts, and that's your regional planning councils. They're also important in making transportation funding decision, as well as your state legislature, right? So your state legislature sets the funding, sets your budget, sets the investment level, as well as the policy that affects the various programs and how they're administered. So there's many different levels you have to be involved in, but certainly most of our conversations today will be focusing on the Department of Transportation. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kim, and we'll get our conversation going.
All right, wonderful. Thank you both for that introduction and opening comments to set the stage for today. So we know that state DOTs are the most influential players in transportation policy at all levels, but you also need local, state, and federal support and partnerships to make things happen. But states have an outsized role. And so this is a critical time for advocates to engage with their state DOTs. Many state DOTs began as a highway department with a singular focus on roads. Today, roads remain a top priority, but we have seen in recent years that it's become more common for active transportation and multimodalism to be part of the conversation. What concerns us now is, as we approach reauthorization of the federal transportation bill, we see a current threat of going backwards. We see leaders in Congress have called for a singular focus on highways. The American Association of State Transportation Officials, referred to as AASHTO, has a reauthorization agenda that calls for consolidation of transportation alternatives with newer programs that have distinct purposes and significant costs, like vehicle charging infrastructure, that may dilute the ability to achieve either goal. And further, the advocates, they advocate for the ability to transfer more funds out of the Transportation Alternatives Program without accountability necessarily for program goals, which we see has undercut the congressional intent that transportation alternatives be a dedicated set aside for active transportation. So my first comment and discussion point for you is that if you ask a member of Congress who they listen to most about transportation policy, they always point to the head of their DOT. And this year, many states are asking Congress for more control over federal money, less accountability, and in some cases, as I mentioned, the consolidation of transportation alternative programs. So can you speak a little bit to how advocates can influence how their states wield the influence over federal policy?
I'll take a crack at it. And it's a challenging, big question. We could spend the whole hour just on this. I am actually speaking to you from the annual meeting of AASHTO, so very appropriate context. I serve on the Council on Active Transportation, and AASHTO created that the same year, I think, that my division was created. So I've been on it from the beginning. AASHTO represents the voice of all 50 states and the territories. So it will never say exactly what I want it to say. It will never say exactly what Florida DOT wants it to say, or Texas, or anybody. It is a synthesis. And I guess it's just take that as a given that it cannot be perfect. You can work on trying to do something about the old, or you can work on trying to build the new. And so I sort of aim myself towards building the new. Some of this is very state specific in terms of how many points of entry you have, how many people you have willing to listen. I want to go back. This is actually kind of not an answer on the federal point, but on Ken's comment that he couldn't be an agent of change inside a state agency. Oh, yes, yes, yes. And it depends on the agency. So I think some of the work might be, you might be trying to change what Congress does. And I think depending on your state, you will know whether that is talking to your state DOT, trying to be present with the leadership, taking regional administrators on bike rides to show them conditions, those kinds of things, so they really get a sense of the needs. And maybe it is doing that with your member of Congress and their staff. And so it's hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer on that, I want to say. And I want to come back to what we can do inside the DOT if you're interested. But I'll stop there and see what Ken has to say from Florida, which is a different context.
Well, it's been a long tradition in Florida that they want to do what the local communities want, right? They really have baked into their system, listening to what the local MPOs and the local governments want, and really trying to build facilities that are appropriate for that local community. And we're lucky enough that trails are very bipartisan in Florida, so we really don't have to worry about some of the politics that start to play out in Congress is in Florida, and that's because of the strong support at the TPO and MPO levels, and trails are so much baked in the way that we do our business, not only within the Department of Transportation and their Florida Transportation Plan and that whole process, but also it's baked into how we attract. We're a tourism state. We depend on visitors to come and empty out their wallet here in Florida. In fact, there's several bills that will be listened to about doing away with ad valorem taxes, instead replacing those with sales tax dollars. So we very much count on visitors, and trails are a recognized part of Visit Florida's program, as well as individual counties' economic tourism department. So it's we have a unique environment where we need trails to help be successful. And so that allows us to take an approach more so of a nonpartisan approach. So that's, I think, it's been one of the successes in Florida. Now, as far as Congress, Florida, because of its size, we always have important leaders, and we've been able to lean on them most of the time because of that strong local constituents. They don't want to be the congressperson to come back and have to explain to their community why their trails program isn't receiving robust support from the federal government. So I think that makes it a little bit different. Now, I find out the challenge in my work on the Great American Rail Trail. I also do quite a bit of work in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. And so one of the things that I've enjoyed about working in that particular project is, being plucked out of my safe haven of Florida and being dropped down in states that I'm completely unfamiliar with, and having to reestablish and build relationships from new. So my experience in those states is quite different than what I experienced in Florida, but certainly having that strong nonpartisan support is helped equip me so I can have those conversations in other places of the country.
Great, thank you, Ken. And Barb, you mentioned in your comments about implementing change from the inside as well. And so I'll ask this of you, and then Ken can chime in as well. But what makes a strong DOT, and what can advocates do? Who can they reach out to? What can they do to help build on that within a state DOT?
Every state DOT head will tell you the first answer is funding. Every one of them will say they are underfunded for really basic things: filling potholes, cutting vegetation, sweeping snow, making sure the bridge doesn't fall down. So if you are speaking the language of the state DOT, you want to think about the constraints they're working with. I think that's a piece of it. The connections with state legislators, I didn't mention that as who you take on a trail ride, but that's another way to think about how do you get to both the state DOT and to members of Congress. People start as state legislators and run for Congress. They allocate state funding if you have state funding going to trails. And so any and all are fair game for that kind of relationship building. Then your state DOT hears back from them those questions. What are you doing? The constituents in my district really want this trail. Are you going to build it as part of that highway project? Depending on the state, the funding flows really differently. So in my state, there's a lot of earmark projects similar to congressional earmarks. And so communities will advocate for direct funding for a trail. DOT doesn't get to say yes or no. That money is dedicated to that. So there might be those kinds of conversations. So then it's coming to the DOT, not from the DOT. I am incredibly fortunate in being in the infrastructure setup that I have. I should say the institutional setup. I am pretty close to the top of our agency. If you look at other states, they're not all going to put active transportation positioned in quite the same place. But you definitely want to be connecting with that person and saying, what are your ties to what your state DOT says? Do you get to review things? Do you get to provide comments when a draft comes out of the AASHTO Bike Guide or the MUTCD, for those who don't know, Municipal Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, signs and striping, and a lot of other things. The MUTCD was a center of advocacy a couple of years ago, and state DOTs submitted comments. So who submitted the comments from your state DOT? What comes up through those processes that get built into the manuals? And this is a very roundabout way of saying, so Congress says to do things, but engineers will design and build a certain way based on the manuals. So what is inside the state DOT process that affects their comments on the manuals? Because that's going to change the work of every engineer in the country. So got you away from Congress a bit, but it's one of those things I don't think people think about. But man, commenting and marking up manuals and plans always matters.
Ken, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I would just add the state transportation plan. That whole process is a very important process to understand. You know, that is the plan that starts to set the funding priorities for the agency. And so, you know, even I used to just, one of the first things I would do when we would have a draft copy of our Florida transportation plan is I would just simply, how many times is the word trail mentioned? How many times is the word pedestrian mentioned? How many times is the word bicycle? Just to kind of, that's not the end all, but it is an indicator that kind of helped me understand, are we being considered with the other modes that are being discussed and included. So being part of that, being part of a committee, you know, I would say a person that's important to know in each state DOT is, in some DOTs, they call it the chief planner. Some people call it the director of system planning, but those positions tend to be right there in the center of the universe as it comes to the design manuals, as it comes to the work program development, as it comes to making, you know, TA funding decisions, and building the Florida transportation plan. So I would certainly make an effort to understand those processes and reach out to those folks and don't wait till there's some sort of crisis before you start, you know, reaching out to your friends over at the departments. They need to hear from you both in the good times and the bad times. And just also remember, when you have disagreements is with those people, that every fight's not to the end, that there's, at the end of the day, you still have to work together tomorrow. And so you should keep that in mind when you're trying to make changes.
Do not burn the bridges. I will add another point of contact to consider. Every state has now been directed under previous federal legislation to develop a vulnerable road user safety assessment. And they took different paths to get there, but find your state's VRUSA. Who prepared it? You probably have a state safety engineer or state safety office of some kind. Whose name is on that report? And those probably didn't go out for public comment. That was probably an in-house process or a consultant written process, but now it exists. What does it say? In our state, one of the things it says is the percentage of fatalities close to a transit stop or a school on a state route is incredibly high. It's north of 70%. So places where we should be prioritizing funding would be near transit stops and near schools. And so find those patterns within the data, and then how does that connect to the opportunities for Trails to be part of the solution to that? And ask if you can meet, point that out, use the data when you're meeting with a legislator or anybody else. Say, here's what's going on in your state. People are dying. Do you want to do something about that? The answer should be yes. It will be yes. And what solutions then can you bring that relate to trails and active transportation?
Yeah, data is so important in improving the points that you're trying to make in your advocacy work. And I will mention with the vulnerable road user assessments, they're part of the strategic highway safety plan. So as those plans get updated, there's generally an opportunity for public comment and public participation in the development of those plans. So that could be another avenue to look at, is the development of your strategic highway safety plan as well. And yes, Ken, you talked about the importance of the state plans and being involved in that. But there's also the local plans. And Barb, I'm wondering if you could speak some to the local planning and the importance of being involved in the local plans and the roles that, and Ken, you may want to elaborate on this as well, the roles that the MPOs play in some of the transportation alternative funds.
Absolutely. Every time I talk to any group, I say, be in the plan, be in all the plans. And all the plans isn't even just the transportation related plans. Does your school system have a plan for how they're going to site schools? Are they going to put them where kids can walk and bike to school? Or are they going to build a new school in a greenfield location that means lots of school buses and parent drop off and harder to walk or bike to? What does your public health district do that is planning for an active community? Those kinds of things. Thinking about planning for an aging population, which we all need to do. And if you're driving today, you will be aging out of driving safely, and your kids are going to take the car keys away. And it's not a fun conversation. I've been through that in my family. And so tying the need to do something about active transportation safety, and again, where trails might be part of the solution, tie it to these other concerns. What's their plan about? And how are you part of the solution? Because you are in so many ways, whether it's health or transportation independence in your later years or mobility today for non-drivers. There are a lot of opportunities to comment. And then that rolls up to an MPO. They don't build or maintain facilities. They are responding to their boards, which are generally elected officials, hoping to get a project in their jurisdiction. And then that's going to roll up to the state transportation improvement plan. And if you're going to comment at that point, it's too late. So you have to start locally.
Great, thank
I'll
you.
just build off that, Barb, in that so I'll give you an example. The Tallahassee MPO, they have a TPAC, Transportation Planning Advisory Committee, and that's the committee that makes the funding recommendations, priority recommendations to the MPO for the TA program. And you had talked about that nexus between school siting and transportation siting with a better planning and to incorporate those into communities. I'm not so sure I would do this in my older years, but in my younger years, we actually in Tallahassee in the TPAC, we were getting very frustrated how the land use decisions were being made by the Planning Commission and how the transportation decisions were being made by the MPO, and there was no discussion or interaction there. So we actually voted ourselves out of existence. So as TPAC, we voted ourselves as no longer being recognized as a citizen committee as part of the MPO. And then we forced the TPO to take action. And what they did was they, and this didn't stand the course of time, but what they did was they actually put a Transportation Planning Advisory Committee member on the Land Planning Commission. I was chair at the time, so I served in that ex officio capacity. The Planning Commission already has a lot of tasks. So what we did wrong in that miscalculation is taking the amount of work that the TPAC was doing together with all the work that the Planning Commission was doing and putting it on the same folks. We made our point. Ultimately, the TPAC was recreated, but we made our point, and the discussion then started happening of having that conversation. So there's a little story of where we went to an extreme of voting ourselves out of existence to try to force that conversation.
And let me tag on to that. Land use planning and transportation shouldn't operate independent of each other. Each is shaping the other. So whatever comprehensive planning process your locals have, you need to be engaged in that. And I want to add, if you like something that's in it, say that too, because your positive comment might be offsetting somebody else's negative comment about the exact same content. And it's really easy to go through and mark up what's wrong with a plan, pointing to what's done well. Great start. You could build on that in the next iteration, whatever it is. Don't forget to give some cookies along the way.
That's good advice. Yeah, so we've talked about interacting with your state DOT personnel and establishing relationships with them that start early and maintaining regular, consistent relationships with them. Who inside the state DOT should advocates interact with? Is it the top leadership, those managing our issues, like your bike ped coordinators, or those engaged in broader programs and processes like planning? Where would you tell advocates to invest their time?
I think I would start with whoever the designated bike ped coordinator is. That's an official role. Every state has to have one. And then ask them from there. We'd like to have a regular conversation with you. Who else could be in this same meeting? So you don't have to necessarily set up 50 different meetings for a regular update on what you're working on, what we're doing. Who would we meet with in our home region? So you have a relationship at headquarters, and then you have a relationship with the people actually building and operating the system where you live. So all over the state, you would have some kind of a regional office, district contact. Somebody there might not be an active transportation coordinator as such. I think, often get sent to planning. You can ask about, what about traffic? Traffic is making decisions about how often you refresh the paint at that crossing, or maintenance. Do not forget to talk to your maintenance folks. I think we tend to think about, like, the design engineer makes the decisions, but the rest of the time it's operations and it's maintenance. And so you really want relationships with them as well. As far as how far up you go, I feel like that's really state specific. Opportunity, if you have any kind of a statewide conference, is to invite the head of the agency to be one of your speakers. We routinely do that. We have a Bike Walk Rural Summit in Washington. And when you go to our agency and ask the secretary to speak, you're also asked, what do you want the secretary to say? Busy people have a system for talking points. You could write the talking points. Like, somebody's got to, channel those up through the secretary's office, but have some great stories to tell and things that they can say that are positives about their agency and partnering on trails. And they just said it out loud in front of everybody. Just gave away a state secret there, but look for chances for someone who is in a leadership role to express things that you want them to be saying to their own people and to others. And those opportunities are there.
And Ken, what has worked for you in Florida?
Well, I would say the TA manager in Florida is also runs a program we have called Sun Trail, which is a state-funded program, $50 million a year in addition to the TA, and also a couple large one-time contributions to the program. So I would say Robin's probably one of the most popular people in the entire state of Florida. Knowing that person, understanding that process, having a dialogue so that you can get feedback on the applications that you may submit early. That type of feedback can help strengthen programs. So that's someone that I would say is very important. And then to echo what Barb said, the groundbreakings, right? Those are not only the groundbreakings, but the trail openings as well. Make sure that those folks get invited and get out in front of the press and are recognized for the investment and the hard work that they've done to make that project happen.
And a point Ken just made, I should pick up on as well. In our state, the Rec Trails funding comes off the top and goes to the Recreation and Conservation Office. And so knowing the bike ped coordinator should know, where is the Rec Trails funding going? And then where is the rest of TA going? And it's not necessarily within the same agency.
Okay, and you've both shared some strategies for maintaining consistent and long-term relationships with your state DOTs. Is there anything else that you'd like to share as far as those strategies go?
Well, I mean, we've talked about some of the easy stuff, but I think, when you do find yourself as an advocate where you don't agree with the position that an agency's taking, letting them know how you plan to go about your advocacy, I think is just being forthright with them. You don't want to surprise them with, a bad press article or with an action alert that's not expected. We give our friends over at DOT a heads up when we are activating our advocacy members and folks. And I just want to remember there are rules of engagements, and so you can have a disagreement. You can have advocacy so that the department sees the breadth and the depth of the support for the program. But remember, there are red lines, and you should be careful of those red lines.
I think that's so true, Ken. If you think about how would you want to be treated on the receiving end? Would you want to be yelled at? Probably not. Might trigger some bad childhood memories right there. So, when you disagree respectfully. I also really like questions rather than answers. So if you think something isn't playing out the way you want to, if you say, can you talk to me more about why that trail isn't being extended that extra half mile as part of that highway project, just making something up. You might find out there's a funding answer and there is nothing anybody can do about that. Or is there, right? You just ask them questions instead of saying, you're so wrong. Why are you stopping short of that other connection? And then being part of a solution if there is one. Maybe there's a local partnership that funds the last half mile. I know fundraising is the fun part, but knowing why something's happening gives you then that chance to look for a common ground. Like Mike could be part of your solution instead of just being somebody who came in yelling at you because you're wrong. I also really like localizing whatever it is. So if you were looking at advocating for a statewide trails funding package, if you were talking to a region office and saying, and in your region, this would be these trails, and here's why those are important. If you are talking to the legislator, these trails in your district, and cute kid on bike who wants to ride there, do not hesitate to use children and puppies in your photo ops. The more it's kind of personalized rather than depersonalized, I think that the better and the more effective you'll be.
Great. And to add to that with the local projects, it typically takes a combination of local, state, and federal resources and support to make a project happen. So you've given some examples. Do you have any other advice for those looking to advance a local trail project?
Can start.
Yeah, have a funding plan, right? Don't when you start your trail project, you should be thinking about what's your funding strategy before, just being rail trail specific. It seems like most advocates, the first thing they want to do is call the railroad. And I always try to tell everybody that's not the first person, because you're not going to be able to answer the questions that they have for you. And as soon as they find out that you have no funding strategy, they're going to tell you to call back in 5 years when you have one. And so, it's very important to have looking at it from a single project or a regional project perspective, put together a funding plan, do your homework, gather there's a lot of economic impact data that's out there, build your case prior to certainly reaching out to the railroad, and probably even before you reach out to DOT, show them that you've taken the time to do some research and put some work into it.
Yeah, and that makes me think of the rail office as another state rail office as another point of contact. We have a rail freight imports director who's my colleague, and so that's another person who might be worth meeting with, or their planning director for rail. What do they know? What they know some things that are coming down the line, so to speak. And
Yeah.
sorry, Kim, will you repeat the question? Because I know I had another thought and I don't want to let it get away.
Sure. What advice do you have for those looking to advance a local trail project?
So yesterday, I was in a really great long workshop about accessibility in rural settings. And one of the examples was in Lincoln City, Oregon, where they're building a park, and they did amazing fundraising based on the universal design principles, the accessibility that they were building into the park, and in ways you don't even think of. Does the bathroom have an adult changing table? So someone who needs help with that can go into that bathroom and find a place for themselves. And for an $11 million project, which is enormous for that city, they raised about, it was over 3 million, like 3.6 million out of donations that came specifically because they were centering that accessible experience. And so that's another one of those sets of who are your allies you maybe haven't been connecting with, who is working on disability justice in your community, because trails are an amazing place to get outdoors and feel free and independent no matter how you move down that trail. And I feel like there's a lot of strength that could come together there. One of the stats in the workshop is that 70% of adults will experience a disability at some point in their lifetimes. Wow. This is everybody, potentially. That's not 100%. I know 100% would be everybody, but 70%, how do you know whether you will be in that 70%? You don't. So you want an accessible future, and trails are fabulous for that.
Great points. Yeah, and so we've talked a lot about state DOT interaction and working at the local level as well. What other state agencies play an active role in transportation?
Ken will have a sense of the variety across states. I know in our state alone, we have, as I mentioned, my agency, we have a separate transportation improvement board that has state funding and some mostly gas tax funding, but they have a complete streets grant program. They fund active transportation improvements. They renamed what was the sidewalk program to the active transportation program. So municipalities apply separately to them for funding. Recreation and Conservation Office does the rec trails. If you're interested in sort of non-transportation specific trails, that will be yet another host of agencies, whether it's a Department of Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife, something like that. And then I think looking at whether the Department of Health is doing anything to really encourage active movement, because physical activity is good for mental health as well as physical health. And I mentioned earlier, I think the seniors aging services kind of entity inside your state. My state is working to, it's designated as an age-friendly state, but that means have an action plan. So is somebody working on something like that? And connecting with tribes as well. If you are looking at any kind of trail that's going to go through tribal lands or serve tribal communities, then you would want to have a direct conversation with tribes and be a good partner with them and understand their own decision-making processes.
So I think Barb hit all the major ones. I guess I would just simply add, to a certain extent, visitor bureaus here in Florida, the BedTax dollars can go to support trail projects and do, as well as the marketing campaign that brings in the visitors. And then I think along that frame of thought is the chambers of commerce. They too influence how decisions are made locally, and certainly trails and transportation issues are part of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and not a state agency, but in my state, we have a lot of port districts, and ports invest in economic development infrastructure, including trail construction. So is there a port district? If you have one, does it have an elected board? And what do those board members think about trail development as part of their contribution to economic development? I'm glad Ken mentioned tourism. Our state doesn't have a state tourism bureau, so I forgot about that. But definitely bike tourism is a strong selling point.
And you made me think of one. We have a place in Florida called Cape Canaveral. And so Cape Canaveral will be participating in the Coast to Coast Trail. There'll be the eastern terminus. So when you go over the Intercoastal Waterway, you'll actually go through the Cape to get to the East Coast. And so I always thought you didn't need a rocket scientist to design a trail, but it doesn't hurt either. So
great. Well, thank you. So I want to allow time for audience Q&A, but before we move into that, I'd just like to ask both of you if you have any closing thoughts or anything else that you wanted to cover in our discussion today that we did not get to.
I'll share one thought, and this is from a long time as a zealous advocate, moving into a more tempered and diplomatic advocate. And politics definitely knocked some of the sharp edges off. We don't get further if we are anti-driving and anti-car. And it's very easy to feel like the car is the enemy, the person operating it needs to do better. We know which one is carrying the killing force into an impact, right? Like that's just the physics of it. A lot of people drive. And if we say, well, you need to stop driving so I can have my trail, you're not going to win. because probably most of your legislators drive and probably most of the folks at the state DOT drive. So how can you position it as this will make it safer and more predictable for everybody using the road? This is a win for everybody. It's not a takeaway. And I think for the next few years that safety is going to be one of the strongest selling points for trails and any kind of active transportation infrastructure. There are some very clear signals at the national level that if you sound like you're taking things away from cars, you will lose. And so you don't want to say that's your goal. And realistically, it's not a winning goal. So make it a win for everybody. Talk about it that way, because when a driver gets out of a car, they're a pedestrian. They too need a safe crossing. So just work on behalf of all of us and think in multimodal terms, and I think you'll get farther.
I guess my kind of closing advice would be, I didn't recognize it when I was younger, but as I've gotten older, I recognize the importance of it. Just like someone who would be new to the workforce is planning out their career, they're wanting to do this type of work so they can gain this type of experience because ultimately they want to go here to work. I think if you're going to be a long-term advocate, you need to kind of think that way about building your advocacy resume as well. And sometimes that's volunteering for campaigns and not wearing that campaign on your sleeve when you're in a nonpartisan situation. But that's how you build the relationships. That's how you get the credentials. It's about getting those appointments we talked about earlier. Many states have appointments that are made by the speakers and the governor or the Senate presidents that are citizen advisory committees that you can pursue. But to think about mapping out your advocacy career just like you would your working career. And sometimes those intersect, like they have for me, where my career is advocacy. But if your career selection doesn't intersect, then certainly give some thought about how you're going to build that resume and how you're going to get the standing you need to build the relationships and get the results that you want.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's move into the audience question and answers. We've had several good questions come in here. The first one is for Barb, and it is anybody within the DOT advocating for currently ongoing projects that may be on hold or threatened? They're experiencing this right now with Washington with a RAISE grant, currently on hold due to contract changes from FHWA. Local jurisdictions have no contact with federal officials, and they need strong advocacy from the state to unlock these funds.
And depending on which RAISE grant that is, it might be the one where I'm waiting for a signed contract amendment back. I don't know. There are a couple that involve trails, and we were very successful as a state in getting some, including a really big one on the Olympic Peninsula for a lot of trail planning. Honestly, I don't think there's anything advocacy can do to speed up federal highways. There is a lot of process, there's a lot of churn. Obviously, a lot of them were furloughed for quite some time, so everything that was already on hold got slowed down a bunch more. I think asking the office you've been in contact with for that contract, let me know how things are going. It doesn't hurt to ask every once in a while, but we are periodically pinging, are we going to get that signed contract amendment back? And in the case of the one I'm directly involved with, it has projects in Seattle and Spokane, so it might not be the one they're thinking about, but you can ask. I don't think it will change speed.
Okay, and which state agencies are involved in land use and transportation? And what about Vision Zero?
What's funny is state agencies are almost not involved in land use most of the time. Most of the decisions are local. Look at your local land use codes, zoning codes, things like that. That's not going to be a state decision. Within the state DOT, are they looking at the nexus of transportation and land use? And certainly we are. We added to the safe system approach, which is it's had 5 categories. So safer roads, speeds, users, vehicles, and post-crash care. We added safer land use in our strategic highway safety plan. And so what is it we do as an agency around access management, around how many left turns or right turns are there that are going to cut across a trail is an access management question for state DOT and a land use question. So there's some work, but depending on your state, I don't know, Ken, do you know of any states where the state has an agency that actually directly makes many land use decisions? I mean, unless it's state lands.
Well, interesting bill being debated right now in Florida would, regardless of a local government's comprehensive plan, the would be so trying to improve on affordable housing, giving the ability to add a second dwelling regardless of what the local planning guidelines are. There is a bill where the state would would intervene and say that land use would be possible. So kind of almost the opposite thing in that case, and it's from the perspective of affordable housing. But I would say in Florida, the comprehensive plans that's where you have your land use is spelled out, and densities and transportation, long range transportation plan. So look at the comprehensive plan if you're in Florida. And then also at a local level, the planning commissions, they're the ones that are approving the land use at a local level. And so keeping an eye and understanding the planning commission in your local community as well.
Yeah. And I'll add to that, I think there will be a tension in a lot of places between the need for more affordable housing and more low income housing specifically, and where people think, oh, it's really easy. We'll do ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and that's a bunch more housing. If that's on a bunch of half-acre lots as the city stretches out more and more, you haven't reduced driving, you haven't improved active transportation mobility. And so because you're putting more cars probably from those places onto roads that weren't designed for that much density. And so I think being really careful and understanding the housing crunch needs and where it could be done more cost effectively is probably infill inside a place that already has sewer, already has roads, all of that kind of thing. Really engaging in the land use conversation will be important to maintain the safety of the whatever facilities we're able to add.
Yeah, and you just nailed the real debate points on the head there. That's exactly the conversations that are being had right now.
Okay, this question is for both of you. Do you have some resources that outline organizations that are attractive partners, and especially what angles are most interesting to them to help us in relationship and coalition building?
I don't know if, I guess one list that I think of is that at the back of our active transportation plan, there is an appendix that talks about the kind of engagement we did. And we did a survey, and then we looked at what kind of locations and interests or perspectives that hadn't been picked up in the survey, and then reached out to organizations to meet with them or to hold a webinar, whatever we might do. And so looking at that as a cross section of what we did, and then knowing your community, if it's a place with a lot of runners, maybe there is a running club that's really interested in trails to run on. And so there's going to be some sort of specific or idiosyncratic things, but looking at the stakeholder lists or the partner lists in any public state plan for who they contacted, and then look for who isn't there. I think that's the tricky part, but who isn't there that you know? Because I'm thinking of the ways that we can bring active transportation into our sort of our everyday conversations and work. And does your workplace have a bike rack is a question, right? And so what are you already a member of or involved in? You're a doctor. Are you a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility? What are they doing about their transportation safety? So start from what isn't there and start from what you're already involved in.
Yeah, that's really a good approach, Barb. I agree. There's not really too much I have to add to that.
Thank you. And I would add that Rails to Trails Conservancy has the Trail Nation Collaborative. If you're not a member of that, you may want to consider signing up for that. There's some great opportunities there to network amongst your peers and learn from that. And there's also a playbook that we have on our resources page, and some tools for advocates that we can drop into the chat for you as well. Okay, so this next question is, in my state, much of the TAP funding is allocated to local government to design and construct projects. However, local governments have difficulty implementing these projects in a timely manner. Do other states provide assistance or manage these projects to ensure projects are completed sooner? And maybe you could each speak to what's happening in your state.
I can say for Washington, we have delayed delivery kind of across the board. And there's a set of factors. There's been cost increases, a lot of retirements, a lot of newer people hired to fill those retirement slots. So then you have somebody coming in with maybe less experience in how this agency manages things. We had, a huge effect of the pandemic on who was working and who left the workforce. And I think local agencies are just drowning and trying to catch up. So that's sort of some things are not going to be fixable in the short run question, but finding out what is the specific delay. Is it you lost some matching funds and it's time to go find some more? Or is it you changed the order of your projects because you needed to move this one on up because there's an emergency fix? Like, again, asking why and then seeing if there's a way you can be part of the solution.
Well, I'm a little spoiled in Florida, I must say, in that the state of Florida makes the 20% match on behalf of applicants. So that's a big boost. And there's also a lot of work done in the project development so that good projects are getting fed into the work program. They've already certified the right of way. They've done some project development already. So I'm very proud of our DOT and their obligation rates consistently for the last I would say at least a couple decades. So a little bit spoiled on that question.
Yeah, there are several states that are using toll credits to provide matches, which is something that you could look into in your state for that as well. Okay, so we have time for one more question, and this one is for Barb. And so what is your role or Washington DOT's role in checking on local compliance with state and federal funding grant commitments?
Our local programs division is the one that oversees how the funds are used. That's if we give a grant, it's really local programs that's doing the work of signing a contract and then reimbursing as those invoices come back. And certainly we all want to have a happy result if there's an audit. So they are on top of those. And we will only reimburse for things that are directly tied to the grant. If there are other expenditures where they're not coming to us for reimbursement, we would not be monitoring those. That would be a separate question. And again, if you've got multiple state agencies giving grants to a project, that means if our Transportation Improvement Board gave a grant, they're monitoring the piece they paid for. We monitor the piece we paid for. Your city's audit structure monitors how they're using the local funds. So yeah, not easy to follow the money in that case.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we're about at that time for wrap up. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I want to thank Barb and Ken for sharing their insight and expertise. And before we go, I want to mention that RTC will be hosting a December webinar on statewide planning for the trails and active transportation. You heard Barb discuss Washington State Plan, and you can take a look at that. There's a link to it in the chat. And you can learn more from this webinar as we demonstrate the impact of these plans, what it means for there to be a statewide vision, and how the plan can be actively implemented, not just a nice document. And with that, I'd just like to ask Ken and Barb if they have any closing comments.
I want to thank you all for caring enough and for engaging, because it really does matter. And I mentioned positive comments as well as negative comments if you're commenting on a plan, but paying attention and asking those questions and showing up really counts. And I think you can build those relationships, ask good questions, and be realistic about the short-term gains, but they add up. I mean, you don't get to the end of the trail by jumping there from the beginning, right? You have to travel the whole length of the path. So we can travel that together.
I would just say thank you for joining us. You got a great opportunity to be involved in advocacy here. We're entering a reauthorization of the highway bill right now, federal highway bill. And so there's going to be a lot of debate over the next, hopefully not a year, but maybe over the next year or so. So everybody will have a lot of opportunities to try out their advocacy skills over the next year. And we hope you do.
Great. Thank you so much for your valuable input and sharing your knowledge today. All right, take care, everyone. Have a great afternoon.